9:14 a.m. local time. The Pacific sky was a hard, polished blue, the kind that makes distant shapes seem smaller than they are. Camp Redfield, a forward U.S. Marine Corps installation along the island's western coastline, was fully in motion. Morning physical training had wrapped. Motor transport crews were cycling vehicles through inspections. Administrative sections were open, coffee cooling beside keyboards. It was the familiar tempo of a force stationed near friction, accustomed to living with it. Then the screen changed. On the coastal surveillance display, 14 low-flying contacts surfaced at once, rising out of sea clutter less than 60 kilometers offshore. Tight spacing, uniform speed, altitude below 300 feet. Too low for civilian routing, too deliberate for accident. IFF grids populated automatically. No transponder returns, no flight plans filed. Vector straight toward the base. The Air Defense Watch officer did not hesitate. 14 rotary wing contacts, bearing 032, fast inbound. There was no shouting. The installation shifted modes. The general alarm cut through the air in a sharp metallic pulse. Marines stopped mid-task. Tools hit pavement. Office chatter died instantly. Weapons lockers opened along interior corridors. Quick reaction. Forces moved on rehearsed paths toward assigned defensive sectors. At 9:16, visual confirmation came from a coastal observation post. 14 gray-painted transport helicopters in staggered assault alignment. Twin-engine lift profiles, low over the waterline. Formation spacing indicated multiple insertion points, likely 7. This was not a probe, it was an insertion package. Inside the lead aircraft, Chinese Special Operations troops sat compressed shoulder to shoulder, rifles secured between their legs. More than 200 operators distributed across the 14 helicopters. The rehearsal had been precise: land simultaneously, fracture defensive cohesion, destroy priority infrastructure, withdraw before fixed-wing response sealed the airspace. Their margin, 25 minutes. 25 minutes to hit barracks, fuel storage, communications arrays, vehicle yards, headquarters spaces. 25 minutes to create a visual rupture strong enough to echo beyond the island. At 9:17, Camp Redfield's command hub was fully staffed. The base commander spoke evenly. Condition 1. Engage on confirmed hostile insertion. 7 defensive sectors activated at once, each mapped months earlier, each layered with interlocking fire corridors and hardened fallback points. Defensive geometry mattered, and the defenders were already distributed. At 9:19, the helicopters crossed the outer perimeter. They divided exactly as predicted, pairs peeling towards separate zones. Barracks block, maintenance compound, communications mast, fuel depot, armory annex, command building, logistics yard. The choreography was disciplined. Side doors opened before touchdown, ropes uncoiled, assault teams prepared to descend in synchronized waves. From altitude, the maneuver appeared overwhelming. On the ground, it met a grid. At 9:20:12, the first helicopter stabilized over the motor pool sector. At 9:20:17, a Marine anti-armor team inside a reinforced service bay aligned a shoulder-fired launcher along a pre-marked backblast channel. At 9:20:19, the rocket fired. It struck beneath the rotor assembly before the aircraft settled weight. The detonation sheared the helicopter sideways, scattering flame across the asphalt. The fast rope ignited mid-drop, severing the first insertion element into smoke and debris. The element of surprise lasted seconds. The remaining 13 helicopters continued their descent. The assault had crossed the point of reversal. Chinese operators hit ground under immediate fire across multiple sectors. They moved with cohesion, splitting toward assigned objectives, demolition charges visible, suppression rifles working to carve space through the defensive lattice. What their planners had underestimated was density. Camp Redfield was not a light administrative post. It housed an infantry-heavy Marine regiment on rotational alert, more than 700 Marines on base, every building familiar, every angle rehearsed during exercises few believed would ever be real. By 9:21, U.S. fighters from Kadena were already climbing. By 9:22, all perimeter access gates were locked down. By 9:23, Japanese self-defense units initiated external containment beyond the fence line. The tide had not yet reversed, but it was no longer flowing in only one direction. But resistance had already hardened. In the barracks sector, Chinese assault teams breached a secondary entrance using compact charges. The blast opened steel and concrete just enough to force entry. Inside, 30 Marines were already positioned behind reinforced interior cover. The firefight that followed lasted less than a minute. The attackers expected confusion. They encountered layered defense. On the communications sector, 2 helicopters completed partial landings. 30 troops dismounted and advanced toward the antenna array, moving in disciplined wedges. They were met with intersecting fire from elevated overwatch points pre-sighted during routine-based defense drills. Rounds struck with precision. In the fuel depot zone, Marine snipers began targeting demolition carriers before they could reach storage tanks. Explosive satchels fell beside their owners. By 9:24, 2 more helicopters were destroyed on the ground by anti-armor teams firing from concealed positions. Thick black smoke climbed over 3 separate sectors. For the first time since departing the mainland, uncertainty entered the assault. The 25-minute plan had been designed around collapse through shock. Instead, it had collided with readiness. Helicopters were still descending. Gunfire was still intense. Casualties were rising. But the Marines were not scattered. They were tightening. As the clock approached 5 minutes since first contact, the central question shifted. Not whether the base had been surprised, but whether the attackers could endure long enough to matter. 9:24:37 local time. Synchronization was gone. What began as a coordinated 7-point insertion had fractured into 7 independent engagements. Smoke poured from the motor pool and barracks sectors, turning the clear sky above Okinawa into a layered haze. Burning aviation fuel rolled across pavement, igniting debris and casting sharp silhouettes through the chaos. The acoustic profile changed, less landing noise, more sustained gunfire. The plan had required momentum. Momentum had evaporated. At Landing Zone Alpha, near the barracks complex, 34 Chinese operators reached ground before their helicopter was destroyed. They pushed aggressively toward the main structure, firing controlled suppression at windows and rooftops. They anticipated panic. They met geometry. Inside, Marines had established tiered defense, ground-level suppression teams, stairwell denial positions, rooftop overwatch. Fields of fire overlapped deliberately. Ammunition discipline remained intact. By 9:25, nearly half the attacking element at Alpha had fallen attempting to force reinforced entry points. Survivors shifted toward flanking movement. They discovered something else. They were being flanked. Marine reinforcement squads moved laterally between structures through hardened corridors, using concrete barriers and vehicle hulls as mobile cover. The defensive grid was not reactive. It was rehearsed. At Landing Zone Bravo, near the communications compound, 30 attackers advanced within 200 meters of the antenna field before anti-armor teams eliminated their helicopters. Their objective was disruption. Sever external contact. Freeze response. They had not accounted for redundancy. Even as one communications mast sustained RPG damage, secondary nodes activated automatically. Signal routing shifted without pause. By 9:26, heavy machine guns had been repositioned to elevated maintenance gantries, delivering plunging fire into exposed formations below. Mortar teams deployed smoke to distort attacker sightlines, then adjusted to fragmentation rounds targeting clustered movement. Bravo sector attackers were compressed against perimeter fencing, with no extraction path. Overhead, the equation shifted again. At 9:27, the first pair of US F-15 fighters entered the operational airspace at altitude. They did not fire immediately. They observed. 6 helicopters remained either hovering uncertainly or attempting emergency liftoff. Their pilots faced a narrowing decision window: remain and provide cover for ground teams, or disengage and abandon them. At Landing Zone. Charlie, near the command facility, combat tightened. Chinese assault teams detonated breaching charges against an auxiliary entrance and forced entry into an interior corridor. Inside, the fight compressed into feet. Rifle fire echoed through reinforced hallways. Flashbangs burst in narrow passages. Ceiling panels shook loose from concussive force, but every hallway inside that structure had been prepared for this scenario. The attackers carried diagrams, the defenders carried repetition. By 9:28, Charlie Sector attackers were reduced to fragmented cells holding temporary interior positions. They had penetrated. They had not secured. Across the base, a realization was forming. The assault had achieved contact. It had not achieved collapse. And with every passing second, the defensive weight increased while the attackers' margin narrowed. The tide had not yet fully turned, but it was no longer moving forward. It was pushing back. They had not seized control. At Landing Zone Delta, adjacent to the fuel storage complex, the engagement unfolded with clinical efficiency. Sniper teams positioned on reinforced warehouse rooftops eliminated demolition carriers before they reached the primary tank structures. One assault element succeeded in placing an explosive charge against an auxiliary fuel conduit, but sustained defensive fire disrupted timing. The detonation produced a localized rupture and flame column, dramatic but contained. No cascading ignition followed. The Marines defending Delta did not counterattack impulsively. They constricted. Fields of fire narrowed deliberately. Movement lanes were denied. Angles were sealed. Every minute reduced the attacker's maneuver radius by measurable increments. At 9:29, the air domain shifted decisively. An F-15, cleared through Regional Command Authority, launched an AIM-120 against a helicopter attempting to lift from the Foxtrot sector. The missile impacted during climb transition. The aircraft disintegrated before clearing base altitude, debris scattering across the outer perimeter road. That strike marked the inflection point. Until that moment, theoretical extraction remained possible. With one missile, the premise collapsed. Remaining airborne helicopters broke formation. Two dropped low toward open water in an attempted escape profile. One was intercepted within seconds by a second missile, detonating over coastal shallows. Another absorbed concentrated ground fire during climb, trailing smoke as it veered east under visible structural damage. On the ground, Chinese assault leaders recalculated. There would be no retrieval, no reinforcing wave, no sustained air cover. The 25-minute window had contracted into immediate survival. At 9:30, 10 minutes from first touchdown, the operation transformed from offensive penetration to attritional containment. Marine reinforcements continued flowing from interior facilities. Every available defender was integrated into the defensive grid. Units were not crowding sectors. They were reinforcing geometry. 7 landing zones ceased functioning as coordinated fronts. They became isolated enclosures. At Echo Sector near the Armory Annex, Chinese troops mounted a final concentrated push towards secured weapons storage. Suppressive fire intensified. Movement accelerated across exposed ground. They entered a pre-sighted corridor. 2 AT-4 rockets fired in sequence into grounded helicopters being used as improvised cover. The resulting explosions neutralized both aircraft and the majority of personnel sheltering behind them. The blast concussions rippled across adjacent sectors. By 9:31, no assault element anywhere on the base was advancing. All were holding fragments of contested ground under increasing pressure. Marine units did not rush a final assault. They compressed deliberately, sector by sector, meter by meter. Above the installation, F-15As maintained combat air patrol while additional aircraft launched from regional bases. Japanese self-defense forces tightened the external cordon, sealing perimeter exits beyond the installation fence. At 9:32, intercepted Mandarin transmissions began fragmenting. Urgent requests, confused coordinates, repeated calls for extraction. None would be answered. The tide had not turned explosively. It had shifted incrementally, predictably. 7 landing zones, 14 helicopters, more than 200 attackers, against a base that had rehearsed distributed defense repeatedly under scenarios most considered hypothetical. By minute 12, the conclusion was unavoidable. The assault achieved insertion. It did not achieve dominance. And in engagements defined by sustainment, dominance, not shock, determines outcome. 9:33:14 local time. The assault stalled completely. What followed was compression. Across all 7 sectors, Chinese special operations elements were no longer maneuvering as cohesive assault units. They were reduced to small clusters, 5 here, 8 there, pinned behind wreckage, shattered barriers, and burning rotor assemblies. The doctrine had relied on synchronized shock. Shock dissipates. Structure endures. At Landing Zone Alpha, remaining attackers attempted a breakout toward the motor pool perimeter, likely seeking mobility assets or concealment. They advanced in a compact wedge, firing suppressive bursts toward barracks windows. They entered intersecting arcs. Marine elements had already repositioned to deny lateral escape corridors. Elevated firing positions along depot structures produced overlapping engagement zones, converting open pavement into a lethal funnel. The breakout collapsed in under 90 seconds. At Bravo sector near the communications compound, 3 attackers reached the tower base and affixed demolition charges to an external junction assembly. The explosion severed primary lines. For 4 seconds, internal monitors flickered. Secondary systems activated immediately. Hardened redundant nodes rerouted traffic automatically. The command network never fully disengaged. The attackers anticipated linear failure. They encountered layered redundancy. By 9:35, Marine units initiated formal counter-isolation procedures. Rather than pursuing scattered elements across exposed terrain, defenders sealed sector boundaries and reduced interior pockets methodically. Fire teams advanced in coordinated bounds, always covered, always flanked, never exposed without overlapping support. Air superiority was absolute. Extraction corridors were closed. Ground maneuver space had vanished. The battle no longer hinged on whether the attackers could complete objectives. It hinged on how long isolated elements could endure without reinforcement, without mobility, without the sky. And as the clock advanced beyond minute 15, endurance, not surprise, defined the engagement. The tide had not merely resisted, it had reversed, and the reversal was permanent. Fire teams advanced in coordinated bounds, always under cover, always supported by flanking elements, no gaps, no overextension. At Charlie Sector, inside the administrative complex, the final interior holdout attempted to fortify a stairwell leading toward a restricted operations wing. The Marines did not rush. They deployed flash suppression devices, then cleared step by step, weapon-mounted lights cutting through smoke residue still hanging in the corridor. Angles were checked, corners dominated, movement was controlled, incremental. Close quarters engagements ended in seconds. The defenders were not improvising under stress, they were executing repetition. At 9:36, 2 helicopters that had hovered indecisively near Delta Sector committed to simultaneous low-level escape toward open water. They did not clear the perimeter. An F-15 achieved lock and launched. 1 helicopter detonated mid-climb, fracturing over the coastline in a plume of debris and burning composite. The second descended aggressively, attempting terrain masking across coastal structures. It absorbed sustained ground fire during egress and dropped below radar altitude heading east. Its survival remained uncertain. What was certain was this: there was no remaining air support over the base. On the ground, the psychological vector shifted. Chinese elements that had advanced with cohesion now consolidated defensively. Ammunition consumption rates spiked. Radio traffic fragmented into overlapping, urgent transmissions. Attempts to reposition toward interior storage structures were met by hardened defensive presence already in place. At Echo and Foxtrot sectors, Marines initiated systematic sweeps, advancing behind armored vehicles and reinforced barriers to eliminate isolated shooters. Every movement covered by Overwatch. Every sector cleared in sequence. No theatrics, only arithmetic. Over 200 attackers dispersed across 7 landing zones, 800 defenders inside a prepared grid. Time favored only one side. At 9:38, 18 minutes after first touchdown, the engagement crossed its decisive threshold. No Chinese unit retained offensive initiative. No landing zone remained tactically contested in a coordinated sense. What persisted were contracting pockets under growing pressure. At Delta, the final demolition element attempted to reach a secondary fuel conduit. They were neutralized before closing the distance. At Bravo, surviving attackers regrouped inside a maintenance garage. Marines sealed both exits and forced capitulation through controlled fire and concussion devices. At Alpha, isolated fighters continued firing from behind the skeletal frame of a destroyed helicopter until ammunition exhaustion ended resistance. At 9:40, sector commanders reported in uniform cadence, hostiles contained, no coordinated maneuver. The tide had not surged, it had locked. The assault designed to overwhelm was now confined within its own footprint. Above the base, additional U.S. aircraft layered air dominance. Maritime patrol units expanded coastal sweeps for secondary threats. No inbound reinforcement signatures appeared. No extraction corridor remained. At 9:42, Japanese self-defense forces completed outer perimeter lockdown. Ground escape options were eliminated. Inside the installation, firefights diminished from bursts to isolated discharges. The Marines did not accelerate toward conclusion. They compressed deliberately. At 9:43, the final organized resistance at Charlie Sector ended when a small, coordinated cell attempted one last movement toward the communications bunker. They were stopped within meters. By 9:44, 24 minutes after first contact, only scattered shooters remained. No structure, no cohesion. The helicopters were destroyed or withdrawn. The initial shock was gone. What remained was inevitability. At 9:45, command transmitted a single directive across all sectors: clear and secure. The difference between assault and annihilation is sustainment. By minute 25, sustainment belonged entirely to the defenders. The strike had been bold, the response had been disciplined, and discipline under layered defense prevails. 9:46 local time. Coordinated gunfire ceased. What followed were isolated reports, single rifles discharging from behind shattered walls, overturned vehicles, and burning airframes that no longer provided meaningful cover. The assault had lasted 26 minutes. The pivot occurred at 18. The collapse began at 23. Now it was containment. Across the base, platoon leaders reported sector status in clip transmissions. Alpha secure, Bravo clear, Charlie interior swept, Delta neutralized, Echo controlled, Foxtrot stable, Golf under containment. No cheering, no raised voices, only confirmation. At 9:48, 2 remaining Chinese soldiers emerged from behind a damaged logistics vehicle at Foxtrot. Weapons discarded, hands visible. They were disarmed, restrained, and removed from the engagement zone. They were the first to surrender. They would be the last. Elsewhere, isolated fighters continued resistance until ammunition depletion or incapacitation ended engagement. Marines advanced methodically, never abandoning cover, never clustering, never exposing unnecessary risk. This was not retaliation. It was doctrine executed under pressure. By 9:50, sector commanders confirmed no active hostile maneuver across the installation. Medical teams transitioned from combat triage to controlled evacuation. Explosive ordnance disposal units began clearing unexploded charges near landing zones. Air dominance remained uncontested. The perimeter remained sealed. At 9:51, 27 minutes after first touchdown, the base command center logged the engagement as operationally resolved. 14 helicopters had launched a coordinated strike. Within 25 minutes, the tide had turned. Within 30, the assault had ended. Camp Redfield remained intact, damaged, scarred, but operational. The attackers had achieved entry. They had inflicted loss. They had not achieved control. And in base defense doctrine, control, not insertion, defines victory. The sky above the Pacific remained blue. From outside the perimeter, nothing suggested that 200 armed personnel had attempted to fracture a Marine installation less than half an hour earlier. But inside planning rooms on both sides of the region, the lesson would be recorded precisely. Shock without sustainment collapses. Structure endures. And once the tide turns inside a hardened grid, it does not turn back. It was procedure. At 9:49, airborne surveillance confirmed no additional contacts departing Chinese airspace. Long-range radar sweeps remained clean beyond standard civilian flight lanes. Maritime patrol overlays showed no secondary naval movement correlated with the strike. The assault had been singular. There would be no reinforcing wave. By 9:50, explosive ordnance disposal teams began deliberate clearance of each landing sector. Undetonated demolition satchels were rendered safe on site. Unexploded rocket-propelled grenades were flagged, photographed, and secured for forensic review. Fire suppression units extinguished the final active flames near the vehicle depot. Foam blanketed scorched concrete. Rotor fragments and shattered composite lay scattered across blackened asphalt. Smoke still drifted low across portions of the base, but the air was clearing. Damage assessment began immediately. 3 primary buildings showed external structural impact from rocket strikes. Facades fractured, windows blown, reinforced frames intact. One communications relay mast required replacement, but its functions had transferred automatically to redundant systems within seconds of initial damage. Fuel storage remained uncompromised. The armory was untouched. The command center had maintained full operational control throughout the engagement. The attackers had inflicted casualties. They had not achieved systemic disruption. At 9:51, 31 minutes after the first helicopter doors opened, Base Command formally logged the engagement as tactically concluded. Total hostile personnel inserted, 196. Estimated killed in action, 188. Captured, 8. 14 helicopters confirmed destroyed, some by ground-based anti-armor fire, others by air-to-air missile engagement. No aircraft successfully extracted assault teams. American losses were recorded without embellishment. 19 Marines killed in action, 43 wounded, several in critical condition. Numbers matter. Victory does not negate sacrifice. At 9:54, Japanese Self-Defense Forces units moved into coordinated outer security positions beyond the installation perimeter, reinforcing containment and assisting in airspace management. Liaison officers integrated seamlessly into the regional command net. Alliance response had activated without delay. The strategic message extended beyond the gunfire. At 10:02, Regional Command received a consolidated operational brief. 14 helicopters launched, 7 landing sectors engaged, strike neutralized within 25 minutes. Installation fully combat capable. No critical infrastructure compromised. The assault had been engineered to generate shock imagery, trigger international panic, and leverage political pressure. Instead, it generated a different conclusion. Speed without depth collapses. By 10:10, the base transitioned from combat posture to controlled recovery. Casualties were evacuated under armed supervision. Weapons collected, cleared, and cataloged. Intelligence teams photographed serial numbers, insignia, communication devices, encryption hardware. Every artifact would be dissected, every transmission reconstructed, sector rotations resumed by midday, defensive positions re-established, ammunition stocks replenished, vehicle readiness verified. The base did not evacuate. It did not suspend operations. It did not alter mission tempo. At 10:22, U.S. aircraft resumed visible patrol arcs along the coastline. High-altitude contrails traced deliberate patterns across the sky. The signal was unmistakable. Presence continues. At 10:37, satellite feeds confirmed smoke columns rising from the wreckage of 14 helicopters scattered across the installation perimeter. Across regional command centers, analysts recalculated force projection assumptions. The planners of the strike had relied on compression, surprise, velocity, psychological impact. They had underestimated layered readiness, distributed defense grids, and alliance integration. 25 minutes had determined the tactical trajectory. The strategic reverberations would extend far longer. By noon, international media reported hostile helicopter incursion repelled. Terminology varied, emphasis shifted. Official statements framed events in measured language. Inside the base, none of that altered reality. What remained factual was this: 14 helicopters initiated a coordinated assault against a prepared Marine installation. Within 25 minutes, the attackers lost initiative. Within 31 minutes, they lost the fight. The installation remained operational. The defenders maintained control. The tide shifted not through emotion, but through structure. In modern conflict, Surprise creates a window. Sustainment decides who survives the opening. That morning, sustainment belonged to the side that never surrendered its grid. The final entry in the operational log read without flourish: "Base secure, mission continues." The tide had turned. And it did not reverse.